Hey everybody, it's Randy Ray, the literate Texan here at Driftwood Ranch, and by request I have a video today where I'm going to go through Steve Donoghue's list of essential fantasy novels. But they're not really, it's a list of 25 novels, but they're not really 25 novels because some of them are series that comprise multiple novels. But I had a commenter in my video about A Wizard of Earthsea. I had to think about that for a second. Who asked me to go through the list and talk about the ones I've read and the ones I haven't read and so forth. So I used to be quite a fantasy reader, so I was actually surprised and pleased with how many of these I've actually read. So I'm just going to go through these one by one and tell you what I know about them, if anything. Some of them I've never heard of. The first one that he recommends is the Great Book of Amber, which actually consists of, I believe it's like 10 books, the Chronicles of Amber, right? So there were 2 story arcs, and each one took up 5 short novels. Steve said to just think of them as one really, really long novel with those books being chapters. But I came to Amber the way I think some other people come to Amber. It was a diceless tabletop role-playing game that my buddies played, and they absolutely loved it, talked about it all the time. And so at some point I picked them up and started reading them much later in life than my friends had. And they were really interesting. Those were written by Roger Zelazny. I have not read all of them, but I'm pretty sure that I read the first story arc, the first 5 books. The first couple of which I actually remember pretty clearly. The other 3 books, I started to lose interest in them after the other 2 or 3 books in that order. So yeah, I've read some of the Amber books, but not all of them. And I'm not opposed to reading all of them. I mean, if Steve says they're good, they're probably good, right? That's what he says anyhow. The next one is one that I've never heard of before. It's called The Bloodied Chamber by Angela Carter. I had to look that one up, and it turns out this is a collection of short stories that are based on traditional stories. It looks like 3 or 4 of the stories in the collection involve werewolves. Looked kind of interesting to me, but I don't know anything about it, so I'll check it out. I'm not going to hold up anything for this video because I've got a list of these on my computer screen and I'm just looking at those. So, if you're waiting for me to hold up a book, it's just not going to happen. Well, actually it is going to happen because I do have one of the books right here handy. Okay, number 3 on his list, and it was a 25 book list, was The Complete Chronicles of Conan. And there've been various editions of Conan the Barbarian, Conan the Cimmerian come out through the years. I grew up during the 1980s, so I grew up on those little paperbacks where you had the Robert E. Howard stories along with the stories by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter. And sometimes they were stories that Robert E. Howard had written about a different character that they just converted into a Conan story. And I remember there were 12 or 13 books in that series. And they went in chronological order through Conan's life, at least through their version of the chronology. So it was like one long epic. Of course, this is not how Howard originally wrote or published the stories in the Conan canon. Say that 5 times fast, the Conan canon. But actually, the first story he wrote and published about Conan is from the end of Conan's career. So I don't have this centenary edition that Steve showed on his video that's got all of the stories in one book. I have the 3-volume set from, I believe it's Del Rey, but it's got all of them, and it's just the Robert E. Howard stories, and it's just in the order they were written, so it's really cool. I've read all of these before. I'm reading them again for Cimmerian September, and I'll probably rank and rate the stories later this month when I do my end of the month wrap up. The next book on the list is called The Dragon Waiting, which was written by John M. Ford. Now, this is a book that I had not heard of before Steve's video, The Dragon Waiting. I understand it's a historical novel with the addition of fantasy elements like vampirism. Apparently Richard III is in it. But I do know who John M. Ford is because we just finished Book Trek. And John M. Ford had written a few Star Trek novels. And I did look him up on the Wikipedia. It turns out John M. Ford also wrote a lot for the Traveler role-playing game. And even better, he wrote the Yellow Clearance Box Blues for a role-playing game called Paranoia, which was absolutely terrific. So yeah, that looks like a good one for me to hunt down and read. So The next ones that he suggested was the Books of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is probably why my friend commented that that I should do this list, because, I just reviewed A Wizard of Earthsea recently. I'm looking up the name of the gentleman who suggested this to me. I believe it's John Ruchala, but it might have been Michael Ruchala or something like that, but I'll know here in a second. Let's see here. James Ruchala. Sorry about that. And I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, James, but thanks for the video idea. So, anyway, the Books of Earthsea, Ursula K. Le Guin. I read the first one and it was really terrific. I didn't realize this was a young adult novel when I started reading it, but it was aimed at teenagers. I thought it's an absolutely terrific fantasy, and I'm eager to read the rest of the books in the series. I think there are 6 books in the series, although I wouldn't swear to be right about that. And looks like, let's see here, according to Wikipedia, there's A Wizard of Earthsea, The Tombs of Adawan, The Farthest Shore. Those were all published in 1968, 1971, and 1972, respectively. And then it looks like this later series is Tehanu in 1990, Tales from Earthsea in 2001, and The Other Wind in 2001. So anyway, yeah, I'm ready to dig into those. Those look terrific to me. So let's see. Elric of Melnimony by Michael Moorcock. Okay, so when I was growing up, they came out in little tiny paperback novels. And I think each novel was made up of 2 smaller novels. But anyway, this was another one that had a fantasy role-playing game associated with it. I really liked Elric because he turned the whole Conan the Barbarian thing on its ear. Instead of a warrior, he's a sorcerer. Instead of being big and strong, he's very sick and has to take medication to stay alive. Anyway, terrific set of books, beautifully written. I know there's been a lot of other Elric novels and short stories written since then, and I believe they're all collected in these 3 hardcover volumes that have come out. I've got the first 2, which I understand, if I'm not mistaken, are basically the books that I read growing up. So, but yeah, I cannot recommend Elric of Melnimony too highly. It's wonderful. Next on his list is Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series. Okay, so if there's a series of fantasy books that I love more than Elric, man, it's got to be Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. These guys are terrific. Basically, you've got this, 6'8" barbarian with red hair and a beard from the frozen wastes of the north, and his best friend is this small, dark, cat-like guy from the city. And they're thieves, and they each have a wizard patron who gives them adventures to go on. And it's all really weird and kind of cynical and definitely sword and sorcery at its finest. I absolutely love it. The next on the list, number 8, His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, which is a trilogy that I have not read yet. I do have it here, excuse me, and I do want to read it. I loved the movie, The Golden Compass. I have not seen but 1 episode of the HBO series, but what I saw of it looked really good. I remember there was a little controversy around the movie when it came out, because I guess the author, Philip Pullman, is as much of an atheist as C.S. Lewis was a Christian. So, C.S. Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, which we're going to talk about in a minute, as a Christian allegory. So my understanding is that the Philip Pullman Dark Material books, his Dark Material books, are the opposite of a Christian allegory. Now, I could be wrong about that. If so, correct me in the comments, and I will defer to your expertise. Number 9, Jarell of Jory by C.L. Moore. These are some books that I'm aware of but haven't read yet. They came out about the same time as the Conan the Barbarian books, but they're about a redheaded barbarian. Don't know anything about them other than I've heard of them and they're supposed to be good. Number 10, The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. The only thing I know about this one is that it was a big influence on J.R.R. Tolkien. So Steve says that there's a couple of lines or a couple of sentences that have been pulled out of The King of Elfland's Daughter and inserted directly into The Lord of the Rings. So I think that's cool. I wasn't aware of that. Number 11 is The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. Okay, so I have not read this book, but my daughter has. And we watched the movie, I don't know how many times when she was growing up. She absolutely loved The Last Unicorn. And I understand that Peter S. Beagle has written a sequel of some kind to it that I offered to get for my daughter recently. And she kind of turned her nose up at it because I guess she's too old for that sort of thing now. She'll get over that soon enough. And then number 12 might be my favorite book on this list overall. The Lies of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch, okay? So this is basically, I saw a blurb from it for it somewhere that said it's basically like Ocean's 11 in a fantasy setting. It's set in, this is the first book in the Gentleman Bastard series, and it's set in a fantasy version of Venice. So you got all the canals and stuff going on. And Loch Lamora is one of the thieves that work in the city, but these thieves that he works with are the Gentleman Bastards. So they're like basically con men, you know, fantasy con men. Absolutely terrific book. Couldn't put it down. Pacing was brilliant. The characters are interesting. There is nothing negative to say about The Lies of Loch Lamora. It's terrific. Now, I haven't read the other books in the series, so I don't know about those. Number 13, The Lord of the Rings. What am I going to say about The Lord of the Rings that hasn't already been said about The Lord of the Rings, right? Of course, The Lord of the Rings was the first real fantasy that I ever read after The Hobbit. I read it probably 6 times, and I'm due for a reread. So I'm always excited to reread it. Number 14, Evangeline Walton, okay, I watched the video where Steve pronounced this, the Mabinogian tetralogy. So I don't know anything about this other than what Steve said in his video. So go watch his video if you want to know more about it. I guess it's based on some actual folklore, and, you know, it creates characters and character arcs for them. Number 15 is the Book of Merlin, which was originally meant to be part of The Once and Future King, but was published separately from The Once and Future King. But it's about King Arthur as a boy being taught by Merlin. And if I remember it correctly, I've read it 2-3 times when I was a teenager. If I remember correctly, it had a lot to do with Arthur being turned into various animals and learning lessons from being an ant, for example, for a while, or a bird. So anyway, terrific little book. It's not very long. T.H. White was a wonderful writer. Number 16, The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. I have not read The Mists of Avalon, but I understand it's also about the Arthurian mythos, but it focuses more on the women characters in the Arthurian mythos. I have read some Marion Zimmer Bradley. She used to be published very regularly in the magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, which I have a lifetime subscription to, and I've been subscribing to since 1982. But she was also featured in a collection of short story anthologies that I'm a big fan of called Thieves' World. But I don't remember which character was hers. So, number 17 is The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, which I came to relatively late, but I really like The Chronicles of Narnia, especially when they're read in the original order. You know, I don't know why it is that book publishers feel like readers can't keep up with a series of books if you don't arrange them in the order of their internal chronology, but Lewis didn't mean for them to be read in that order, but the publishers put them in that order. And it actually detracts some from the story and the storytelling if you read it in the order that the publishers now recommend. So the next is The Never-Ending Story by Michael End, I can't read that. That's number 18 on the list. You know what? I know there was a movie made out of it. That's all I know about The Never-Ending Story. Number 19, The Once and Future King is the only one of these books that I've got sitting here beside me. Actually, I've got The Lord of the Rings over here too. The Once and Future King is absolutely fabulous. Also by T.H. White. But it's, it's the Tales of King Arthur, and it's as good a rendition of the Tales of King Arthur as you will ever read. I'm firmly convinced of that. Number 20, Silverlock by John Myers. Don't know anything at all about it. I don't even remember what Steve said about it on his channel. Number 21, A Voyage to Arcturus by David Lindsay. I have a copy of this in paperback in my little reading room over there, and I only knew about this particular novel because apparently it was one of Harold Bloom's favorite novels, and I read about it in one of his books. So, and I believe Bloom even wrote a sequel to A Voyage to Arcturus, which was not critically well received, but he probably enjoyed writing it. Number 22, The Well of the Unicorn by Fletcher Pratt. Don't know anything about that either. The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison is number 23. I have read The Worm Ouroboros. I don't know that I would do it again. It's written in a very formal type of prose that made it very, very slow going. It was difficult to read. Now, it might be a little easier for me now that I'm a grown man, have a little more patience. But as a teenager, it was a real turnoff. I'm surprised I even finished it. The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe is number 24 on the list. Okay, so I've heard of Gene Wolfe and I've heard of these books, and I've never heard anything bad about them. They're like universally praised, but I don't really know much about what they're about. So, I'll probably check them out though. And for some reason, and I don't know why, the Vericonium series by M. John Harrison is really intriguing to me, even though I don't really know anything about it. I don't know, but I'll check it out. I do want to mention a couple of fantasy books that I'm particularly fond of. There's a book by John Bel Ayres called A Face in the Frost, which is about two wizards, and I think it's absolutely wonderful, and I recommend anybody who wants to get into fantasy read that. That's probably pretty essential. There was a series of books called the Thieves' World books, edited by Robert Asprin, and this was a shared world anthology of short stories. The original series had 12 books in it with, short stories from different authors. They shared a setting, a fantasy setting, but they each got to write about a character of their creation within this fantasy setting. And it was really terrific. The characters were great. The authors were great. I believe there have been some standalone novels written about the characters who were featured in the Thieves' World books that sort of expanded on the world a little bit too. But I think that's definitely worth checking out. And I had a couple other fantasy novels and books on my mind. I think Little Big was one of the ones that I was thinking about by John Crowley, which I haven't finished yet, but I really like. I think that would have a place on a list of fantasy essentials too. So the nice thing, one thing I was relieved to see too was that a lot of times on these lists, people who are fans of 80s fantasy will talk about the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, Unbeliever. Terrible books. Don't read those. They're just awful. I finished the first of them, and that was plenty for me, and I don't see any reason I would need to go back and try that again. So, but anyway, if you haven't read those, or if you haven't read a high percentage of those, you've got plenty of reading to do, as do I, because it looks like I've only read about half the titles on there. And of those, I haven't read everything in the series for all of those. So, by request, here was my response to Steve Donoghue's video of essential fantasy reading. Hope you enjoyed it. This was, by the way, episode 99 of The Literate Texan. Tomorrow will be episode 100. God only knows what I'm going to talk about for the 100th episode of this channel. But it'll be live tomorrow sometime, so tune in.